वन्दे मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् वन्दे मातरम्। वन्दे मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् सुजला सुफला मलयज शीतला शस्य श्यामला।
To speaker Sapna Little, convener Atul Dev, ex-com members, INTACH members, guests and friends. INTACH is an organization set up in 1984 to involve its members in protecting and conserving India's vast natural, built and cultural heritage. It is with great pleasure that during days of social distancing, INTACH Gurugram chapter is broadcasting a very informative and interesting series. Today's topic of Central Vista and New Delhi, a virtual walk, is a beginning of this initiative. Now, I would request our convener Atul Dev to say a few words.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome on behalf of INTACH Gurugram chapter to Dr. Sapna Little and to all participants of this program this afternoon. Dr. Little, as you probably know, is convener of the Delhi chapter of INTACH, a personal friend who has been, we have been associating with each other for some time now, and I'm delighted to welcome her to our chapter to give a talk on a very interesting subject. I won't take more time because we have limited time on the webinar. So I'll now hand you back to Namrata to carry on with the procedure.
We start by giving a Sapna Little is a known author and historian with specialization in history of Delhi. Being a convener Delhi chapter, she is closely involved in movement to preserve heritage, monuments and sites. Her popular works are Connaught Place and the Making of New Delhi, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Old Delhi, and 14 historic walks. Before we start this talk, I would make an announcement that we have a question and answer session after the walk. So those who want to decodify and demystify their doubts and have some queries can ask those questions or just write on the chat and we will pick few of them and would like to give all kind of revelations. So thank you so much. Over to Sapna for further program.
Thank you so very much, Colonel Atul Dev and Namrata, for so kindly inviting me to speak on this occasion. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of my research over the years, which I have done regarding New Delhi. And I never need any I never needed to talk. So I hope that this is going to be enjoyable for you, as enjoyable for you as to listen to as it has been for me to research. I will just, one heads up to Namrata, I hope you have allowed me to share my screen. I'll speak for a little while and then I want to share my screen so that I can share some images, because I always think that a talk becomes much more interesting if you can see some nice pictures, and that is why I think they will also appreciate that we do walks, because seeing is something which is a completely different experience from just hearing about something. So to begin with, this is a virtual walk. Obviously, I would have loved to have high quality images, maybe some films, but I don't have them. So you will have to see you will hear my words. I will try and explain how Central Vista and New Delhi is. What is this space? We often call it Lutyens Delhi. What is this space? How it has come about? What is its history? And then through some images, I'm going to show you what I'm trying to explain, why it's special. And in the process, you will see some. Many of you must have seen these places. And I'm hoping today to make you see them through slightly different eyes. So to begin with, a little bit about the history. And I think the history is important because why did New Delhi come about? It was created, New Delhi, the history lies in the fact that in 1911, the British government of India, remember at that time, the British ruled India, the British government of India decided to move the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Now, I won't go into a lot of history of why that happened, but certainly a very important part of that was that they wanted to remake, rebrand, as one would say, in these days parlance, rebrand the British Raj. Remember, at that national was rising. There was Bengal was convulsed with starting with the Swadeshi movement in 1905. There had been the rise of the national movement, and the British knew that they had failed to try and suppress the national movement. So they had to try something different. They had tried to partition Bengal. That had caused a lot of resentment. So they realized that to change their tactic, and they decided from their strategy, from a strategy of suppression and oppression, they had to have a slightly different strategy. And the slightly different strategy consisted of trying to win over the Indian people to some extent. Now remember, they are not willing to leave and go, because that would be the ultimate thing that many Indians wanted. But within that, they are still there, but they want to do something that conciliates the people of India. And part of that object was supposed to be achieved by moving the capital away from Bengal. That would do two things. One was to give Bengal a little bit of autonomy, separation from the central government. It would give the province of Bengal some autonomy. Second thing that it would do is to bring the capital of the British to a location which the British had come to realize that a lot of Indians associated Delhi with the center of power, with old capitals of India. And they said, and you can see all this conversation happening in the official correspondence of the British. So all the British officials, whether it's the Viceroy who was Harding, or the Secretary of State, or it's the British monarch, all discussing this. And they say that in India, a lot of people are sentimentally attached to Delhi as a capital. Right from ancient times, there is the belief that it was the capital of Pandavas. Indraprastha was in a location in Delhi, which is associated with Purana Killa. There was also, in historical times, there was a lot of capitals, particularly from the Sultanate onwards, the Delhi Sultanate, then the Mughals, these all India empires, very large empires or large empires, which used to rule from Delhi. So they Indians would like to have Delhi as the capital. And that's one of the reasons why Delhi was chosen. So this is the reason behind picking Delhi. But once they come to Delhi, and I'm telling you this because it does make an impact on architecture as well. I'll do that in a minute. So I'm going to start showing some of the images, and I hope you're going to enjoy this. I'm going to start sharing my screen. What happens, the announcement that the capital will shift comes during the Darbar of 1911. Now the Darbars, the coronation Darbars, these used to be big occasions. Now, British had borrowed these from Indian traditions as well, because Indian rulers used to have darbars, and Indian rulers, of course, had also this tradition of Jharokha Darshan. So, in fact, the Mughals had borrowed this from the Indian tradition to give darshan. The ruler is to give darshan to audience, or like a deity, in fact, to his subjects. And so the British picked up this idea of Jharokha Darshan, and you can see that here King George V and his consort Queen Mary are appearing in that window, showing, giving darshan to the subjects. What I'm trying to show you is that they were picking up Indian sentiments. They were trying to connect with Indian people at an emotional level. So this is when the announcement happens during the Darbar, not at this particular event, but the Darbar. And there itself in the north, and the Darbar was held, if you are familiar with Delhi, it was held in the place which we today call Coronation Park, which is north of the North Campus of Delhi University in Delhi. So that's where this was held. And the first foundation stones were also laid there. But they said that these are provisional foundation stones. It doesn't mean the site has been settled on. So next step was to decide on a site of the new city, the new capital that would be built, and also to decide on a city plan. What sort of a plan would that city have? For that purpose, 3 people who were appointed to a committee. One was Edwin Lutyens, the name that we often associate with this project. The other one was somebody called Brodie, who was civil engineer. He was an engineer. He was a municipal engineer, in fact, from Liverpool. And the other person was George Swinton, who was a councilman. He was London County Council. He was the chairman of. So these people were appointed to pick the site and to make a plan. And again, I will not go into a lot of detail, but finally they decided on this place. What is this place? You will, very few people actually have seen this image. This is Raisina Hill. Now today we know Raisina Hill as the place where Rashtrapati Bhavan and the Secretariat buildings are placed. How many of us are actually know what? I also did not know till very recent.
वैसे हम तो यहाँ से full on करते हैं ना, तो ये तो पूरा on है.
What Raisina Hill actually looked like. So this is actually Raisina Hill in the process of being cut down, made suitable for making the foundations of those buildings. So they picked Raisina as a place. And the reason they picked Raisina was that from this place, Raisina was a site, it was this hill which overlooked a lot of the older left. If you stood on Raisina Hill and you looked towards Purana Kila, which was the old Indraprasth, you would, on the left, you would see the old city, 17th century city of Shah Jahanabad, which was another imperial capital. You would see Firokla, which was the capital of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. And of course, you would see Purana Kila itself, which was the capital of not only the Pandavas, but later Humayun and Sher Shah Suri. So you could see these Delhi's past, as they said. And all this they did explicitly mention in their correspondence. And this was why the site of Raisina was so important. So this is the site that is picked. What happens next? Town plan. They start to think of a town plan. One very important factor in this town plan is the idea that it has to be a garden city. Garden city was a movement which had very, it was a new movement in Britain at that point when development was happening, and they were making these, the idea was to introduce a lot of greenery into urban spaces to improve quality of life of people. They decided that people were living in 19th century Britain, the cities were really bad. They were overcrowded, they were polluted. So they said, let us bring in some greenery. Let us have a city which is going to be green. So that was the origin of the government, and they had decided that it would be a garden city. Delhi also would be. And therefore, they brought in these large plots of land with bungalows. But this also had its origins in an earlier Indian tradition, which the British had taken to, which was the civil lines. Now, if you are familiar with a lot of Indian towns, there is a civil lines. There's a cantonment, there may be an older city, civil lines, and this was characterized by large bungalows set in large green plots. So this was one very important aspect of the town plan. The town plan also had a business district. It had something called Connaught Place. Now this was a private development in the sense that plots were sold to private individuals, but the development, the design had a central, it was designed centrally. You could not, in your plot of land, you could not just make whatever you wanted. You had to follow the guidelines. So therefore it is a unified plan, but it was unit. So this, and I must also acknowledge this beautiful photograph. It is by the very famous photographer Sandeep Shankar, and he has very kindly agreed to have, particularly whenever we talk about New Delhi, to be able to share some of his images. We are very INTACH Delhi chapter is very grateful for him to allow us to share some of these images of his. So this was one of the other parts. Let me first just give you an idea of the town plan. Now, if you look at this plan, it has certain, you would probably be seeing this image of the map now. The red areas are how the plan is laid out. It's very interesting because originally actually Lutyens, and this is very interesting that we call it Lutyens' Delhi. Lutyens had suggested a grid plan, like many modern cities, New York and stuff. So he had suggested a grid plan. He had also suggested that the main road, which we call Rajpath today, that it should go to it would lead from Raisina area to Jama Masjid. Both those sessions were actually turned down finally, and they reworked the plan and made it like this. You can see how it is laid out. It is not laid out on a grid plan. It has many roundabouts. It had many roundabouts. It's a hexagons, triangles. That is how it is laid out. And interesting, you must notice how the reference to the older city is very important over here, because there is this one road which goes, if you look at the vista, if you look at the alignment, it goes from a place, if you can see my cursor at all, from between the secretariats, in a straight line, there is a vista which goes up to Jama Masjid. It's not a street. It's not a full road. It doesn't, because that would have involved demolishing inside Shahjahanabad. They didn't want to do that. But it is a straight line. So in fact, if you go along this road, and by the time you get to Minto Bridge, if you look from Minto Bridge, you can see the domes of the Jama Masjid. So that was a very important vista. So they were connecting with the older city. I've already mentioned that Rajpath went straight to Purana Killa, but also Rajpath was parallel to Chang. So in its town plan itself, they are referencing the older cities. They are referencing the past of Delhi. So it is not supposed to be a dominance and erasure of Delhi's past, but rather to connect with Delhi's past, to draw inspiration from Delhi's older cities. This is, of course, another photograph by Sandeep and a full image of the central vista. And you can see in the foreground, you can see the Chhatri, which is around India Gate, which is in the middle of India Gate, that C hexagon. Beyond that is India Gate. And then in the distance at the other end of the vista, you have Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is flanked by the two secretariats. So this was the main ceremonial avenue of New Delhi, which we now call Central Vista. Coming to so I'm going to take you on this virtual walk, which starts from Rashtrapati Bhavan and what the design was. Now you must remember, as I said, that there were 3 members of the town planning committee. Now when it came to the architecture, it was decided that, and again, there was a bit of to and fro about this. There was a lot of discussion. Finally, 2 architects who were appointed. One was Edwin Lutyens. Edwin Lutyens had a good reputation as a builder of large, grand houses. And then the other was Herbert Baker. And Herbert Baker had a history, had recently designed the government buildings in Pretoria in South Africa. So both these people, these architects, were picked. And what was their role? They were to design the important public buildings, government houses, viceroys, which we now call Rashtrapati Bhavan, was given to Lutyens. And what did Lutyens do? So let me just go on. So this is, of course, Rashtrapati Bhavan. In the front of it, you can see the Jaipur column. Jaipur column was a gift of the Raja of Jaipur. People say that the main reason why he had gifted this was because the land on which New Delhi was built had belonged to the Maharajas of Jaipur. That is true. I mean, yes, some of it had, but a lot of land had been acquired. So it was not just their land. There had been a lot of owners, other owners as well. So yes, he had a connection, that Maharajas of Jaipur had a connection to Delhi, but there were other people who had also contributed. So for instance, the Maharaja of Gwalior had contributed a statue of George V. The Maharaja of Bikaner had also contributed a statue of Queen Mary. So this was designed like this. It's called the column. He paid for it at the Maharaja of Jaipur. At the top, this was designed by Lutyens. At the top, you see a 6-pointed star. It is 3-dimensional. So from this angle, it looks 4-pointed, but it's a 6-pointed star. It's supposed to be the Star of India, which was, the Star of India was a order of knights of India, which the British had designed. And then below it is a lotus. But moving on from there, Lutyens was trained in a Western architectural tradition. He was used to, when he was designing New Delhi, what he wanted to do was he wanted to use the old traditions of Greece and Rome and the architecture inspired by those traditions to make New Delhi. And this is some of the early design that he made of the dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan. It looks very different from the dome that is there now. Look at the lantern on top. But let's move on to the next one. What did he actually design finally? This is what he designed. Look at it. It's got a big drum. It's got a flat portion at the top. At the bottom is this wide band that is there with a crisscross pattern. Where did he get this? This is very like the drum he had, the dome and drum that he had originally designed. This is what he finally based it on. And this was because the Viceroy Harding sent both Baker and Lutyens on tours of India. They said, go and see the architecture of India. Don't bring your Western traditions here. We have to make something which is going to be acceptable to the Indian public. Their circle that we are building, that's what we've told them, that there's going to be a different kind of Raj which will be acceptable to Indians. So this is what, so they did go on various tours, they came back with ideas, and this is what Lutyens used as a model. So you can see the dome with the flat portion on top. This is the great stupa at Sanchi. Many of you may have visited or at least are familiar with it in images. And at the bottom, you can see the railing, which is around the smaller railing on top also. And that railing clearly inspired the stupa, as the Rashtrapati Bhavan dome as well. And also the railing which goes around Vijay Chowk. Let's go back here. I'd like you to look at a very interesting feature this has. If you look at below that railing, it gives you an opportunity to look back, compare that Sanchi Stupa again to dome, but also look below it. Below that railing, you can see these two kind of bulging out things. These are two chhatris. These are two chhatris. Now, chhatri, you will be familiar with this term. Very important part of Indian architecture, little cupolas, right? So these chhatris, and now if you look at them, you are hardly visible. They don't even break the outline in some senses. What he had done was he had and I'm not very sure, but I am making a guess here that he based them on this. You can see how the chhatris are very, very close to the main dome. If you look at usual traditions, the dome is there and the chhatris are at a little bit of distance, not so close, but he used this. Now, why did Lutyens do that? It's very interesting. Lutyens hated chhatris. He didn't like the idea of chhatris. When Harding went on telling him, nahi, tumhe chhajja bhi lagana hai, tumhe chhatri bhi lagani, you have to put these things, you can't get away from it. So what did Lutyens do? He did something a little sneaky. He put the chhatri, but he put it so close to the drum, as I showed you, he put it so close to the drum and to the main door, can hardly outline of it from a distance. So, I mean, he was again inspired by this, but the reason he was doing it with this, I think it's a funny story, part of the legend of how Rashtrapati Bhavan came to be designed. Moving on, again, let me give you another view of this. Is an older image, an old archival image of Rashtrapati Bhavan dome, and you can see the chhatris, how close they are. You can see the palace with Hushang Shah's tomb, and that was sorry, I don't know if I mentioned, the previous image was Hushang Shah's tomb in Mandu. And this one, you can see in this image how those chhatris are very close to the dome. He also introduced water into the building in a big way. Inside Rashtrapati Bhavan also, you'll see many fountains and basins and a lot of water. But here, for instance, on the rooftop terrace within the parapet are these bowl-like things. These are fountains. So he introduced water into buildings like a lot of Indian architecture. The Mughals also had introduced water into their buildings. If you look at the Red Fort, for instance, pools, a channel of water going down the main palace buildings. Moving on, other things that were incorporated. One of them was a terraced garden. A terraced garden. This was, of course, an charbagh style. And this idea also had come not out of Lutyens' own imagination, but there was a lady called Constance Villiers Stewart, and she had studied Indian gardens, and she was the one who suggested to Harding that an Indian-style garden would be suitable for Viceroy's house. And Lutyens initially was very skeptical, actually, but he, his clients, who was the Viceroy, was suggesting so strongly to give in, and therefore it was made. An interesting tidbit about this is Sarojini Naidu, who was acquainted with Constance Villiers Stewart. Sarojini Naidu actually suggested a name for the garden, said the Garden of Unity. That would have been a nice name, I think, but somehow that name was never picked. It kept being called a formal garden, it kept being called Mughal garden, and that's what was it. So it was never, that name was never really adopted, but it would be nice, I think. But beyond that, next I want to show you another view of the outside. These are views that very few of us actually get, because these are the side view. Often there's now so many, the trees have grown so big that we can't see the walls very much. But if you look at the walls of the exterior of Rashtrapati Bhavan, you see the sloping, how the sides slope inwards. You can see that. This slope in architecture, we call it also batter, this battered sides. And if you compare, for instance, an older building, this is Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's tomb from the first quarter of the 14th century. This is in Delhi in Tughlaqabad. You can see the inspiration, the very, very steep, first of all, the very plain ornamented side, unornamented sides, very plain sides, and then steeply battered, sloping inwards. So this was also part of the stylistic elements. Some of the decorative elements were also borrowed from Indian architecture. One was jalis. Now, jalis, of course, are very important in Indian climatic conditions, because they let in light, but they cut out the harsh sun. They let in light, they let in breeze, but they cut out the harsh sun. And if you this jali, this is inside Rashtrapati Bhavan, one of the courts, one of the courtyards. And if you look at this jali, look at the pattern carefully, and please compare it to the pattern of this. This is the Khas Mahal of the Red Fort. And look at the pattern here, very, very similar to the jali which Lutyens designed for Rashtrapati Bhavan. So they are picking up, what he did was he picked up examples of what he considered was important, particularly imperial architecture, and he from India's past, and on that modeled that he made, like Rashtrapati Bhavan. The interesting thing is that when you actually go inside Rashtrapati Bhavan, and this is Darbar Hall. If you look at the Darbar Hall, this is one image of it. I'm going to show you another one also. Not as attractive, but it gives you a fuller view of Darbar Hall. This was designed for important ceremonials. Today, when we have all our Padma awards, etc., a lot of the swearings and also used to happen here. Now, because so many people come for these, that they have been moved outside to the forecourt. But a lot of important ceremonies still happen over here. Now, if you look at these niches, these, in 4 directions, 4 round half domes, they're like half dome niches inside it. Inside, it's a domed roof over the Darbar Hall. It sits under the main dome, the outside dome. So this is what this dome is. It's a large room with these kind of 4 cutout half dome niches inside it. Now, if you compare it to this is the Pantheon in Rome. And particularly look at one of the things which of course is both this and the Darbar Hall have an opening in the roof, it's called the Panopticon. It's just an opening in the roof. It's a round opening. And also you see this pattern, which you see over here in the Pantheon, the main dome. In Bhavan, you will see it only in those half domes. Again, this also has in 4 directions, it has those half domed little niches. So definitely an inspiration from home. So now look at what is happening here. Because the interior, it was not supposed that a lot of Indians would come to that interior. So they could afford to make it more European in its inspiration, to be quite so Indian. So I think that was one reason why they decided to go with the Roman proportions and models for this. The other main architect was Baker. And Baker was tasked of designing the Secretariat buildings. Again, very important buildings. Of course, as I'm going on, I would like to also mention the fact that they used as a finish, they used beige and red sandstone. This was also very much part of the Indian tradition. Indian monumental architecture, you see a lot of red and beige sandstone, whether it is in Rajasthan or it is in Delhi itself, there's a lot of this sandstone used. So definitely that important consideration. So this is one of the Secretariat buildings. This is North Block. And this again, a very famous story, which I think I should share. This is the story of the slope. Now, this is the view looking up to Rashtrapati Bhavan from the Vijay Chowk. Now, if you look at Vijay Chowk and if you look towards Rashtrapati Bhavan, you can hardly see Rashtrapati Bhavan. What you can see are the 2 grand secretariats on either side and just about the dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan. And it's only when you keep going down that road, you climb that hill, and finally on the hill that you actually see Rashtrapati Bhavan. Now that is the origin of a very interesting, that's the result of a very interesting misunderstanding that happened. Now what happened was that while the planning was going on, and Lutyens were working to design their respective buildings that were assigned to them, the CPWD. Now all this work was actually done by the Central Public Works Department, the CPWD. And they told these architects that why don't you, once you finalize your, you can do your designing, just finalize the placement of the buildings. Finalize the placement of the buildings, and then we will be able to at least do some of the basic work, preparing the hill, etc. In the early times, it had first, in the original plan, they had decided that the secretariats would be below the hill. They would not be on top of the hill. But Baker managed to persuade both Lutyens and Harding the secretariat be on Raisina Hill. So they pushed the secretariats on top of the hill. And then what happened, and I think I should tell you why they wanted to do it also. Now look at this view of north block, that those projecting wings of the Secretariat building. Look at this. Isn't it very similar to our Secretariat building? Very, very similar. These are the buildings of the Pretoria government, the union buildings, so-called, in Pretoria, also designed by Herbert Baker. Herbert Baker liked to make these grand buildings which rose up like a cliff. You see how it rises up from to a height. It rises to a height, and he wanted to do this in Delhi also. He liked to make it. He said he wants to platform the secretariats, and therefore he managed to persuade Harding as well as Lutyens, and they agreed. So it said, okay. Then what happened? As I said, the CPWD said, now please give us the relative plan so that at least we can start with the basic foundation preparation while you design the details. So then Baker and Lutyens decided among themselves where it would be placed, where secretariats would be placed, where government house or viceroy's house would be placed, and then they approved those designs, those plan on the ground, and they gave it to the CPWD. It was only a couple of years later, when the work actually was quite advanced, that Lutyens realized that what he had agreed to, and he had agreed to it, what he had agreed to, the implication would be that when you saw it from below the hill, from Vijay Chowk, you would see the secretariats and you would hardly see Viceroy's house. By then it was too late, and quite understandably, the CPWD said it was going to be very costly to undo the work, and it was never done. So that is what we were stuck with. Later, Lutyens, I think, underplayed the fact that he had actually agreed to this first. So it became a huge point of conflict between the two architects, this business. Look at it from here. You can see why Lutyens was not happy. You can hardly see Rashtrapati Bhavan. The slope is such. But anyhow, it led to fierce conflict between the two architects. Cartoonists made cartoons about that fight. You can look at them, how they are fighting. It shows Lutyens on the left, Baker on the right. They have the instruments that architects use. They are using them as shields and weapons to fight each other. But it spoiled their relationship forever, their friendship. They were friends to begin with, but this ruined their friendship. Also used a lot of Indian forms, but according to me, he did not meld it very well, but what he did use Indian forms. One of these is this kind of opening. We are very familiar with this kind of corbelled niche. We see them in a lot of Indian architecture. Look at the detail of it. It's got the pillars, of course, but it has these corbels. It's not an arch. It's not. There's the beam. There are these These are these corbels that you see of this opening. And look at the inspiration. This is a very, very Indian form that has been there from very ancient times in Indian architecture. This one, of course, is from Balban's tomb. And because even during the Sultanate times, these forms continued to be used. It was not as if they went out of fashion once the arch came in. They continued to be used. So these are very old forms. Also, when he did use European features like this projecting, you can see this one of the projecting wings of the Secretariat. You can see that how it's inspired by these Greek forms. It's the temple of Zeus at Athens, and this, you can see the pillars. You can see the capitals on top. You can see the capitals. These are Corinthian capitals. They have the pillar capital is encased in these acanthus leaves. But if you look at Baker's the capitals that Baker designed, if you look at them really carefully and closely, you see that the acanthus leaves, they are there, but there are also elephant heads. So you can see the elephant heads in those four corners. So this is what he did. He used things like elephant heads to Indianize the motifs and forms that he was using. You can see a closer look at the dome of the secretariats. He used jalis So he also put in jalis over here. You look at the doorway, come to the doorway in a minute. This, of course, is the Basilica of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican, very similar to the dome of the Secretariats. He was inspired by European forms. He mixed European and Indian forms quite a bit. And this is a closer look at the dome of the Secretariat. Here also, as I said, he used jalis. And here also, corners, see if I'll give you a closer look of it. He put elephant heads, again around the dome. So a lot of elephants being carved into the images. Here also a little chhatri. So he was less doubtful about the chhatri. He used a lot of chhatris in his buildings. So in the Delhi buildings, so therefore you see a very prominent chhatri. In fact, as soon as you come up to North Block and South Block, you see these two big chhatris on the sides. Here also there were elephants supporting the top of the pillars. But if you look at the chhatri itself, look at the drum, for instance, look at the pattern on the drum, and you see how similar they are inspired to older Indian chhatri from horse khas. In Delhi, the horse khas monument has a number of these chhatris, so you can see them. This is from the 14th century. Very much inspired. If you look at the doorway, which goes into, this is North Block again, you can see that it's a rectangular frame, big rectangular frame. Inside that, there is a round arched opening. On both sides of the arch, you have these, what we call medallions. And inside the arch is a smaller arch, which is the actual opening, the actual doorway, which is inside North Block. And above that, there's a small balcony with a sort of a jharokha, a small window. Look at the parallels to a 16th century building. This is Arab Sarai. It is in the Humayun's tomb complex. Look at again, there is a rectangular frame. There is a large arch inside that, though this time it's a pointed arch. It's not the round arch. You have medallions on both sides. Inside is the actual opening, which is a smaller arch and a jharokha. So many of the proportions, many of the forms were being borrowed from older Indian architecture. Coming back to what happened, what is in front of the building, I'd like to point out this capital that we have here. This is the pillar capital. These pillars are called the pillars of dominion. Pillars of dominion meaning these were gifts of the dominions of the British Empire. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada gifted these, but these were, of course, designed in India. And if you look at the pillar capital, look at it carefully. I want you to look at the different elements. There's a bronze ship, which shows the empire, how it was connected by sea. And that's sailing on top of a globe. But below that is a lotus. Below that is a lotus motif. And below that is it's a bell capital. It's a bell capital. These are very old Indian designs. So it's an old bell capital from ancient India. And look at that drum, which shows the chakra and the animals around it. I'll give you a closer view of that. I will give it to you in a minute. But look at the parallel. This is the capital from Sarnath. This is an ancient Indian Buddhist capital. The Sarnath capital, in fact, is very important to us today because of the problem of the Indian state. So this was there, the Sarnath capital. And this is the way those, the lotus, the chakra, and the animals. So very, very closely modeled. Finally, if you look at Parliament House, which was designed again by Baker, many people have pointed out that it is possible that some of the inspiration of this round, it's like a round wheel. And inside, in the middle, there is one large chamber. And then, of course, there are 3 projecting chambers also. But that is the main form of it. Is not very different from a temple in Morena district in near Gwalior, which is the Mitauli temple. In a temple in Mitauli, it's called the Chaussat Yogini temple. And if you look at the aerial view of that, you can definitely see the parallels with, it is not inconceivable that Baker was inspired by models like this. Finally, India Gate. I won't spend very much time on it. Of course, there are other inspirations. There's India Gate and there's the Chhatri itself. Some of the inspirations are like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, but again, if you look at the Chhatri itself, its proportions are very much modeled on older Indian forms, like this Chhatri from somewhere in South India. It's not, this was painted by the very famous painter Thomas Daniel, but he did not specify where exactly this particular Chhatri was, but you can see the parallels very closely. This kind of architecture that was designed by Lutyens and Baker, and particularly Lutyens, because Lutyens actually made very, very new forms. Baker just incorporated different elements and put them together. Lutyens reinvented the dome, for instance, and that architecture was also used by the princely states to make their own palaces in Delhi. There are many you have heard of, you've seen your Hyderabad house, Baroda house, Bikaner house, Jaipur house. This is an image of Jaipur house, where the National Gallery of Modern Art is now. Now, if you look at it, it's not a Jaipuri house. The architecture is not Jaipuri architecture. It's not Jaipur architecture. This is the architecture which was designed. It's a special category of architecture which developed in Delhi and under the inspiration of Lutyens and Baker. Lutyens did not design this building. He did not design this building, but it is inspired by Lutyens' design, very, very strongly by Lutyens' design. Particularly look at the dome with its flat top, very much designed by Lutyens. The very plain sides, etc. You can see that this is, so the idea was that New Delhi will have a new kind of architect as well, and to some extent they did follow it in the main Central Vista. So Central Vista is united by a lot of things, partly definitely by design as well. So I'm coming to an end to what I have to say right now. I'm one of those really moving and iconic images of the illumination. This, of course, there's a new illumination scheme now, but this was the old illumination scheme that we used to have of the secretariats and Rashtrapati Bhavan lit up during the Republic Day celebration. So in independent India, we've taken Central Vista and we reinvented it, because these are public buildings that have become or capital, and many of our own rituals were inscribed on those buildings, and meeting retreat, Independence Day parade are very much part of the Central Vista now, the traditions that have grown up with. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to come back and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may like to put to me. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I wanted to ask who the three people who designed the Rashtrapati Bhavan. I forgot the names.
Rashtrapati Bhavan was designed by Edwin Lutyens, right? He was the architect, but you know what architects do? Architects always have to work with their clients. So he actually worked with the Viceroy, because it was Viceroy's house. So the Viceroy was Harding when the initial design was being made. So he obviously with what Harding wanted. And that's why, you know, I talked about the Chhatris. He actually, Harding once, Lutyens once wrote to his wife that Chhatris are stupid, useless things. I don't want to use them. But because Harding wanted them, he had to put them in. But I think your question may be the three people who designed the plan, right? The town plan, which we often think it's Lutyens' plan, but he was not the only one. Lutyens was there. The other person was somebody called Brodie. He was the one who, he was a municipal engineer. The other one was Swinton, 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 and he was a municipal councillor. So these are the people who were involved in making a plan and on deciding on a site for the New Delhi, which was finally chosen as Raisina and the surrounding area.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, Swapna.
So please ask a question.
Very interesting session, and particularly because you took us into that much of detail, I always wondered, why is the Viceroy house or the Rashtrapati Bhavan is at a lower level I mean, is it so that you mentioned that from the Raisina Hills one can have direct views of some of the major developments of that time, or the Firoz Shah Kotla, or the old fort, etc. So is it the Viceroy House or from the place where the North Block, South Block is?
You can. You have to, particularly from, if you go to in front of that bar hall and all, you not quite so great a view. You see, what happened was that because they at the last minute decided to put the secretariats on top as well, so to accommodate the secretariats, that they had to push the Viceroy's house, they had to push it back. And because they pushed it back, then that intervening crest of the hill, interferes with this. So actually the best view you get from the forecourt, the court, the big platform which is between the two secretariats, that's where you get the best view. So yes, that view has been compromised because of this particular placement problem. And it's very very hilarious that such an important mistake could have been made, a very fundamental mistake could have been made. And the main architect, Lutyens, did not even realize it until they actually started building this. So you're quite right. That view is because of the design defect that was there.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Hi,
So
Sapna.
Namita, are you ready?
Yeah, that was a wonderful talk.
So, Sapna, before we wrap up, we have a tradition of giving a small token of appreciation. So today you have to virtually accept this small token from end, from Gurgaon chapter end, and I'll definitely it by post. Thank you so much. Thanks all the viewers for supporting us so much, and we will be having some more sessions like this in future. Thank you all. Namaste.
Thank you very, very much.